Welcome to A Dad's Path, where we navigate the heart and science of parenting. Each episode, we tackle issues that dads everywhere face and deliver actions you can take right away. Join us as we uncover the balancing act of raising resilient, loving kids. Visit us at adadspath.com to learn more. Ready for the journey? Let's begin. Hello and welcome to another episode of A Dad's Path podcast. I'm Will Bronstein. Today we're here with Yael Schonbrun. She's a clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, writer, and mother of three. In her private practice and writing, she uses evidence-based science to help individuals and couples learn to manage work, parenting, and marriage in more effective and fulfilling ways, something that we all work on balancing ourselves. She's been published a ton, including in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Psychology Today, Motherly, among others. And she's the author of Work, Parent, Thrive, 12 Science-Backed Strategies to Ditch Guilt, Manage Overwhelm, and Grow Connection when Everything Feels Like Too Much. It's really a great book. I recommend it. You can order her book wherever books are sold, and you can sign up for her free newsletter, which is called Relational Riffs, on her site, yaelschonbrun.com. We'll put that in the show notes. But welcome, Yael. Excited to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here. As I was saying before we started recording, I wrote this book hoping that dads would pick it up too. So I'm excited to be, in particular, on your podcast where dads are your audience. So that's awesome.
Awesome. Yep. Well, dads, you heard the lady. Pick up the book. By the end of the conversation, I won't need to convince you. So, but yeah, let's start with the book. You know, what inspired you to write Work, Parent, Thrive?
Well, the origin story is that I became a working parent while I was a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University, where I still sit on faculty. And the irony is that I really thought that I would have working parenthood in the bag because I was really excited to become a parent. I had a healthy pregnancy and a healthy delivery. I have a supportive partner. I have a job I love with progressive, supportive colleagues. And so I thought, I would be able to do this thing, right? I'm a psychologist. I sort of had all the tools. And so it was really surprising to me and very disheartening to discover that it was really hard and I was pretty miserable. I would feel really guilty all day when I was at work, analyzing data and writing grants, that my child was with virtual strangers being taken care of. And then at night when I was with him and trying to enjoy him, I would feel guilty and ashamed that all of my colleagues were still working and probably lapping me in their work efforts. And so I started thinking that there had to be a better answer. And so, like all nerdy people, I began to read everything that I could get my hands on from the bookstore and the library. But what I found there was pretty disheartening. And my background as a clinical psychologist is both as a relationship specialist and as somebody who's really enamored with positive psychology, which is the study of happiness science. And so for me, it was not satisfying. And I felt like there had to be a better answer. So instead of relying on the books that had already been written, I started delving into the academic literature. And what I found there actually was more satisfying, because what I discovered was this concept known as work-family enrichment, which is basically what this book is about. So whereas we mostly talk in our modern public conversation about working parenthood, about the conflict between roles, there is this other side, and the science supports this side too. They are both true. But there is a science that suggests that multiple demanding roles can help each other out. They can sort of foster each other and make you as an individual happier and healthier and help you to perform better, more skillfully, more strategically in each of the roles. And for me, that was a really pivotal moment to discover that science. And then I started diving more into the different pockets of life and exploring how our roles can help each other out. And this book is the outcome of that. It's sort of a how-to guide for having your roles, approaching life in a way that has your roles help each other out and help you out in them and help you to achieve greater happiness and fulfillment. And that doesn't mean that you don't feel the conflict between roles that exists too, but it's more about how to strategically take advantage of that conflict using the science that can help you as a guide.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, that's very clarifying, and also I appreciate hearing that. Doesn't mean there's not going to be tension. Like there's a lot we have to do as parents. There's a lot we want to do professionally, in our relationships, etc. So, when you look at what makes someone who tends to be more successful in quote unquote balancing it all, and I don't know if balancing is the right word, but managing it all maybe. What do you see that people do right? And then on the flip side, when you see, gosh, someone's really overwhelmed and what are they missing? What are they doing? Kind of what could they fix? Maybe would be another way of putting that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. Maybe one place to start is even with the word balancing. And I don't actually think that it's the wrong word to use, but I think you have to be careful about what part of the sentence you define it as. For me, balancing isn't an outcome, it's a process. And I think people who do working parenthood or really any life with multiple demanding roles well tend to be people who are sort of moving in and out. I mean, if you think about balance as something that you do and you're done with, then I think that tends to be the mistake, because balancing in life tends to be more like skiing down a mountain, where you're constantly adjusting your position depending on the terrain, and that it's the flexibility of being able to lean or straighten up or slow down or speed up or go around the tree or pause when you hit, a patch of terrain that really you can't overcome on your skis, and take off your skis and move gently around or ask for help. That those tend to be the people who get down the mountain most safely, most happily, most effectively, most enjoyably. And so it isn't about achieving balance and being done. It's about sort of figuring out what you need in the various moments of life to get through most effectively. And that requires this skill that we talk about in the kind of therapy that I practice, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy, which folks who read the book will learn a lot about. And that core construct is something called psychological flexibility, which is kind of defined as showing up moment to moment in ways that matter most to you, depending on your context and what you value most. And being able to make those kind of moves from moment to moment is something that is a skill that we can build over time using some of the strategies that we teach through this kind of therapy that I talk about in the book.
Oh, that's fantastic. I do want to dive into ACT, or the acceptance and commitment therapy, in a bit. And you sort of touched on this, but just to kind of reiterate. So when you see someone who's falling down the mountain, so to speak, to use your analogy, I like that a lot. What are they doing? Like, what do you typically see going wrong there?
Yeah, I think one thing is that, I mean, and this is a little bit the heart of the book too, is that people get very attached to it should be easy. Like if the structures of society, or if my marriage, or if my workplace were more supportive, or if I had family that lived nearby, then it wouldn't feel so hard. That there's something that we do need to fix, and then working parenthood won't be so painful. And I think that's actually a mistake, because a rich, full life necessarily is going to have a lot of obligations. I mean, that's one of the things that the science is pretty clear on. People who are needed in lots of different roles tend to be happier and more fulfilled. But that means that they're going to be pulled in different directions, which is uncomfortable, right? If you're a parent and you love your kids, and if you work and you care to show up in ways that are effective, and if you have a partner who you care to respond to, and if you have a pet that you want to feed, or elderly parents that you want to check in on, you're going to have that tension. And there isn't anything wrong with you or the world or the system that you have that tension. It's part and parcel of being human. And so part of what I think we get hung up on is this distinction between the outside solutions and the inside solutions. So there are things in our world that do need to be better. Like without question, we need more humane policies. Workplaces need to continue to progress and be more supportive. Partnerships need to be more mutual and supportive, and so on. But at the end of the day, if we're fighting against this belief that it should be easy, we're always going to lose. Because even if all of those things are perfect, a life that is full with lots of meaning and responsibilities, which is a good thing, can be tough at moments. Like there's no avoiding it. And so one of the things that I am pretty clear about is that the discomfort is not the problem necessarily. And often, sort of when we get right down to it, the discomfort actually has a lot of meaning. And if we can sort of approach it in a way that doesn't fight against the discomfort, but is rather more curious and more strategic, that actually puts us in a better position to get down the mountain, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. I mean, a lot of people, sort of think, oh, if I were more successful or more rich or more whatever it is, my problems will go away. And the fact is, the more successful you are, the bigger problems you have. But you need to learn to cope with those problems, or deal with them, or however you want to frame that, right?
100%. Yeah, there was this really influential study, one of the first sociological studies conducted by Emil Durkheim in the 1800s, where he collected data on what are predictors of suicide. And what he found was that the more role obligations that people had, the lower their risk of suicide. And I think the science on that just keeps stacking up. Like happier, more fulfilling, healthier lives have more obligations. But again, more obligations comes with role tension. So it's not the role tension that we need to get rid of. It's which doesn't mean that there isn't some level at which role tension is no longer healthy. And we can talk about subtracting, which is my favorite tool. But having role tension does not equate to something that needs to be fixed. It doesn't mean that your life is bad. It simply means you have a very full life. So figuring out what parts can and should be fixed through outside solutions, right, and kind of separating them out from the parts that are just inherent to having a full human meaningful life, and figuring out the psychological tools to manage that more skillfully, I think, is one of the first and most important steps.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So let's, it sounds like subtraction is a big part of that. That's key to your beliefs and how you, I feel like, coach people, right? We sort of know what subtraction means intuitively as a parent, as a working parent in particular, but any parent, I think, can feel, all right, well, what do I subtract? Like I have to do all these things for my kids. I have my relationship. I have work. Maybe I have my own personal health. I might have a pet. To your point, right? So how do you advise people to start subtracting to figure out what's essential, what's not? What does that balance look like?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I like to let people know, so just fair warning to everybody, I love the science. I think the science is really helpful in providing guidance. So I'll often kind of share studies, but then there's clinical practice that go along with it. But the science on subtraction is really interesting. And if anything that I say piques your interest, check out a book called Subtract that's written by one of the lead researchers on the study by the name of Leidy Klotz. But basically what the studies show is that our brain is wired for addition. Like when we encounter a life problem, we're much more likely to come up with solutions that involve additive approaches rather than subtractive approaches, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because in pre-modern times, if you encountered a problem, it was probably not enough social ties, insufficient shelter, not enough calories. And so more was a good choice. But in modern life, that's no longer true. And yet when they study design problems or making an itinerary or making a soup, people routinely pick additive choices even when the subtractive choice is the better alternative, which kind of shows that we have this systematic neglect of subtraction in our brains. So even when taking things off our plate is the better choice, we tend to add when we're confronted with a difficult choice. What's more, and this research I think is especially important for busy people, when we're overwhelmed, that neglect of subtraction as a good choice tends to be even more powerful. So it's kind of like you're rushing through the supermarket and you just came in for 5 things and you're in such a hurry that you're like, okay, I'll throw this in and this in and this in, right? And I think most people can relate to that idea of when we're really busy, our impulse to just be like, sure, whatever, I'll add that thing in too, is really powerful because it takes more energy to subtract. So that's kind of point one, is that subtraction is not a given. We might see less as the ideal outcome, but getting there actually takes more effort. And that's sort of counterintuitive, but an important thing because it causes us to slow down. So this piece of science has been personally helpful to me because now when I feel really overwhelmed, I have this awareness that what I really need to do is slow down and be very deliberate about reflecting on what I could take off my plate. And you can even build in habits, along with your to-do list. Leidy Klotz suggests having a stop doing list, once a week in your weekly planning. Don't just plan for what you're going to do, plan for what you can take off your schedule. When you're deciding what extracurriculars to sign your kids up for, really be deliberate about thinking about if you're going to add something, what should you also subtract? And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't add, but sort of having an eye out for complementing the impulse to add with a more judicious and deliberate intention to subtract can be quite helpful if you want to end up with a life that doesn't feel too crazy making, especially if you live in a life with multiple demanding roles. So it's that awareness. So number one is like the awareness that subtraction is not automatic, and then deliberate practices to think about where subtraction would be useful, and also to use cues of being overwhelmed to prompt reflection on what you can subtract.
No, that's great. And I love, again, that, and, as we were talking about going down the mountain or finding balance, it's not like, oh, all right, now we found balance and we're done. Like it's an ongoing process. And since we're always adding things, I think it's
Yeah.
great having that habit of subtraction too. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like a practice. It's not sort of a one and done thing. It's something that you kind of build into your life. I mean, if it's important to you to have sort of some quiet in there, which for me it is. I mean, I'm really a fan of subtracting and leaving that space empty, right? To have kind of that blank canvas of time reflecting or time just being with your kids on the weekend and not having activities. That's not for everybody, but I find it to be tremendously valuable. And I think the science is not, for everybody, but I think the science supports its value.
yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Just in, sort of anecdotal experience and an experience talking to a lot of dads, it's, you can't always plan the magic moments with your kids or with your partner. And if you don't leave space for them, they certainly won't happen. If all you're
Totally.
doing is driving them to and fro, and you're not, maybe taking them to a birthday party every so often, but you need to leave space and create those kind of moments as much as you can. But if you don't have the time, or if you have some time but you're feeling so overwhelmed, that's also a very difficult place to be in terms of bonding and being the sort of parental leader or model that you want to be.
Totally.
um,
Totally.
and
I'll
then
share. I'll
yeah.
share that yesterday we had. It was a long weekend, and I had my kids home on Monday, and my spouse was home too, and we didn't have anything planned, and I had a little bit of anxiety. Oh God, what are we going to do with this day? And it was really cold, and we have a tree that was like exuding sap, and we live in the Boston area, so we're always excited for mapling season. My kids got really curious about whether they could collect the sap and make maple syrup, so they came up. I mean, they were totally bored, but they came up with this contraption to collect the sap that was melting, and they brought it inside and boiled like this 2 tablespoons of sap, and it like took up the whole morning, and they were full of joy, and it was so creative and interesting and scientific, and it wouldn't have happened if we had activities. And I think that, and it was so sweet and fun as a family. Those kind of moments you can't manufacture, but you need to leave space for them, exactly as you're saying.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. That's a fun anecdote. No, and a great example, and we've talked about sort of the tension that we'll naturally feel a lot of times when we have a lot going on, a lot kind of that we're thinking about. And how would you suggest, as parents, that we can manage that stress? Where it's anxiety, it's and I don't know if this is similar to the ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, or if there's something there. But I'm curious, yeah, how both you, yeah, I mean, how you would suggest to parents, gosh, I have this quote tension, but for me, it's more than tension. It's anxiety. It's feeling like I'm overwhelmed. Where do I start? You know?
Yeah, so the starting point might actually be the framework of the book, which is this idea of work family enrichment, that our roles can help each other out. And I define 3 distinct paths through which they can help. And I'm going to go through this, but the general idea is like a mindset shift about that tension. Because that mindset shift can help us transform that tension into something that serves us better, right? It doesn't mean that it's not uncomfortable, and it doesn't mean that it's not going to end badly sometimes, right? That's just life. But it means that often we can turn that tension, that anxiety, even that overwhelm into something quite profitable for us, for our kids, for our jobs, for our lives. So the 3 paths are, the first is what I call the transfer effect. And that's the idea that every time we're sort of, because of the tension between roles, we're pushed to step out of one role and into another, that we're often pressed to be building skills or doing something in one role that actually helpfully feeds back into the other, which is very helpful for guilt. Like if I have to step away from my parenting role to go do my job, this was often true when my kids were really little and they needed me, but now it's time to go to work, I would feel a sense of guilt. But having that sense of now I'm going to work and I'm doing something that is benefiting my kids and benefiting my work because I'm doing my work, it helps to alleviate the guilt. And there are real concrete things. And through the interviews that I did with dozens and dozens of working parents, there was like really interesting things that people were able to identify. So for you and I, for example, when we're not parenting, when we're doing our podcasting, we're engaging in deep thought. We're doing technology, which is going to help teach our kids, although at some point they teach us more than we teach them. We're taking a task from beginning to end. We're sitting with discomfort when a conversation doesn't go well, which is also something that we're going to have to do as parents. We're, um, learning something new, hopefully. And all of those things help us as parents. Similarly, when we're parenting and we can't work, we are learning patience, compassion. We're learning that sometimes, it's not about what we want to do. It's about what somebody else wants to do. Sometimes we're setting limits. And those kinds of skills can really help in our workspace. So we're often building skills that can transfer from one role to another. So even when we've stepped away from one role, we're often doing something that ultimately can serve the role that we've stepped away from. The second path is what I call the stress buffer effect. And that speaks to the fact that in any role that we have, there's going to be rough patches. Sometime, Will, you're going to have a podcast guest, which is definitely not me, who you really strongly dislike. And you're just going to be glad at the end of the day to go home to your kids who you adore. And sometimes your kids are going to drive you absolutely bananas. So you're going to be delighted to go to work and have a different experience, hopefully a positive one. And I always think about this one interview that I did with a colleague of mine whose child was going through chemo treatment for cancer, for pediatric cancer. And it's not that that was ever very far from his mind, but work provided him a place where he could just, for a brief period of time, think about something else. And that was a real important reprieve for him during that time of his child fighting for his life. And then the third path is what we call the additive path. And that's the idea. Psychologists have lots of different ways of defining happiness, but one of the ways is a life full of meaning and purpose. And so when we occupy multiple different roles that hopefully offer some meaning, it gives us better access to a life that is really full of meaning and purpose. And it also helps to reduce the pressure that's placed on any one role. So for example, as a parent, at some point, our kids are hopefully going to launch their lives and leave us. And it can lead to like a sense of emptiness if that's the only pocket of meaning in your life. Right now, you don't feel like you have that role, that opportunity to kind of be there for your children because they don't need you as much anymore, which is good on the one hand, but can feel kind of like a tragedy on the other. But if you have a balance and sort of the sense of like a complex, interesting life, it doesn't feel as much of a tragedy when one part of your life doesn't offer as much meaning and fulfillment. I mean, the same thing goes if you are really bored in your work, right? It can feel not as threatening if you can find a lot of meaning and purpose in your parenting, your family life, or your hobbies or your spiritual community. So that diversification of meaning and purpose actually can help us put less pressure on any one role and ultimately create a much more meaningful and purpose-driven life as a whole. So those are the three paths. So the transfer effect, the buffer effect, and the additive effect. And so when you feel that sense of tension, you can kind of ask yourself, like, is there a way in which I can sort of identify one of these paths as offering me a sense of enrichment? And sometimes identifying it can actually help you figure out a way to manage that tension more skillfully.
Wow, that's really profound. There's a lot there. I think as parents that we can learn from. So would you, I know a lot of parents who are in positions where they don't have meaningful work, as an example, and they want to be spending their time with their kids. What would you advise them? And then also, I'd be curious how you communicate and what you communicate to your kids. Once they're of age, where you should be teaching them, kind of what you're feeling and what you're going through.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question to ask somebody who writes about this for a living because my kids will tell you that I tell them too much about all the things. um, they're pretty funny about it, actually. Um, if you don't find a lot of meaning in your work, I actually think that parenting provides the ultimate way to reconnect to meaning because at the end of the day, if you're working for a paycheck and that's kind of all you're working for, that is meaningful, right? You're helping to fund a life for your children. You're helping to feed and clothe them and create opportunities for them. I also think it's really important to model for kids a way of contributing to the world outside of our homes. I think that's a way that we raise small people who are eventually going to be big people, who are more sensitized to this idea that we don't just do for ourselves, we try to do for others too. So whether that's, a service industry job or making something or, doing thoughtful work or whatever the case may be, um, earning an income to support our family, but also seeing it as a way to contribute to the world outside of our private homes, I think is really valuable. Not to mention that I think it's really important to teach our children that full lives are healthy lives, right? That we don't want to just center our lives on one thing because that is less healthy. So modeling for them how to do that, how to do it imperfectly, because that's the only way to do it, I think is really useful. The other thing, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were speaking to, but for a lot of parents, especially with the super young kids, we can feel guilty. And I certainly did. Like, it can feel deeply uncomfortable to delegate the care of a really young child to somebody that, was a virtual stranger before they became your childcare provider. But one of the pieces of science that I really like is that comes to this idea of what anthropologists call alloparenting. And that's the idea that we're not actually wired as humans to raise our children alone or by ourselves or in a nuclear family. We're wired to raise them collectively. This is something that goes way back into human history, but in our, mostly Western society, we've evolved into this paradigm where we tend to parent in like, just inside of our house. But actually, that's the less healthy way to do it because parenting is such a demanding job. And it is better for our kids, and the science shows this, to be cared for by non-biological caregivers or even grandparents, so they can be biologically related, but not the parents themselves. It's good for them to attach to other caregivers because not only do they learn to trust other adults, they also learn other lessons because you can't teach them everything, and then you get a break, right? So even if you're working and your work is kind of tiring, it's a different kind of tiring than parenting. So that's actually good for you to get a break from the work of parenting, which can be very depleting without rest and reprieve. So there's all these different ways that the pressure to work can actually serve our children in particular, even when the work itself is not particularly meaningful. Those are just a few suggestions, but there are more examples in the book and different kinds of parents that I interviewed.
Yeah, no, that's great, and it's nice to hear there's science behind that. Also, saying, hey, it's not just you shouldn't feel guilty, or it's okay to feel guilty, not you shouldn't. And I appreciate that you shared that you even felt some guilt. I know I felt some guilt as well. When you have someone else watching your child, but knowing that it's healthy and it's helpful for them. And helpful for yourself, right? I mean, that's another balance that I think we strike, and you wrote about a little bit, is tending, to our happiness needs, right? Making sure that with everything else we're focused on, that we don't lose focus on ourselves, right? And I'd love to talk about that a little bit, because that's something that I know a lot of dads have struggled with and talked to me about, which is I don't have a second in my day, or my second is once the kids go to bed and I've done the kitchen work and I've cleaned up the house and it's now 9:30, I'm exhausted. I don't want a time for myself, but I need it, So how do you recommend kind of creating that buffer there?
First of all, I just want to note that I think it's wonderful that you share that you also felt guilty in the younger years of having your kids with other caregivers. I think that is so important for us to talk more about, especially for dads, because it's such a common refrain for moms, but I think dads don't talk about it enough. And I think it just normalizes the experience. And I will just say, guilt is one of these emotions that's wired into us to help us care for the relationships that are really important to us. It kind of cues us when either a relationship has been damaged or could be damaged, but it is often like the smoke detector, right? Because it kind of, again, hails back from pre-modern times where relationships, if they were damaged, like you could have been, thrown out of your community, which meant that you were going to be, saber-toothed tiger food or something like that. But these days, it can sort of get triggered and isn't terribly meaningful. And so we do need to pay attention to it, but we don't always need to take it too seriously. And we can't know unless we sort of do that analysis of like, how meaningful is this? But it's so normal to feel it. So that's kind of the first thing. When it comes to the busyness and not having time to ourselves, I think that is such a common modern problem. And I do think it kind of comes back to this issue of subtraction, is that we often feel like there's all these things that we have to do. And then by the time we're finished doing them, we're just spent. Like there's nothing left. So, first and foremost, I do think it's important for people to recognize that fitting in the things that fuel us is absolutely critical. Like parenting and life is a marathon, it is not a sprint. And if you do not charge your own batteries, you will get depleted and then you won't be of much service to anyone, including your kids, right? And so if for no other reason, like to be able to be there for your kids, you need to take time off to fuel yourself in whatever way works for you. You know, this isn't like the bubble baths or, I don't know, online shopping. Like it doesn't kind of matter what the thing is, but you need to identify what are the things that help to fuel you, help to recharge you, and figure out where they go and prioritize it. Like block it out in your calendar, work with your partner or your fellow caregivers or even your children to come up with a plan and be disciplined about doing it. I think that that is absolutely critical. And I don't think we talk about that enough, is that it needs to not only sort of be an idea, but it needs to, get into the practicality of figuring out where and when it fits into your day. The other thing that I'll say is, especially for the people with really young kids, because when you have young kids, it's just so physically arduous. You're always on, right? You always got to change a diaper, be available in the middle of the night, and you're exhausted and depleted. I think it's really important to remember that period of exhaustion feels like it's going to be forever. It will end, but you cannot wait until it's over to try to build some of those habits of fueling yourself. And to remember that it's less about the quantity that you give yourself and more about the quality. So you got to figure out when and where it fits in. But a short shower that is by yourself where you are trying to relax and quiet your mind can be really powerful. Or a brief walk, like while your child falls asleep in the stroller, can be, a godsend. And things like physical movement, sleep, and fueling your body are a part of that. Like, those things need to come first because otherwise the other stuff isn't going to stick. So it's about prioritizing it, figuring out a plan, and making sure that the basic physiological needs are met. And sometimes it really is about subtracting the less important stuff so that you can fit what is really important for recharging your batteries in. And I will say that one of the refrains that I often hear people say is, I don't have a choice. I have to do whatever, go to this birthday party, clean the kitchen, make dinner every night. And I will say most of those things are not have to. That's like a refrain that we find ourselves saying, but it's not actually true. Like if somebody had a gun to your head or I don't know, some other kind of scary thing, you would be like, I don't have to do that, right? So most of the things that we feel, quote unquote, that we have to do are actually more optional than we think. They have a cost, but often the cost is worth bearing so that we can find some time to take care of ourselves. So let the kitchen go a little bit, make an agreement with your partner about how to do that. Order in less healthy food during the tougher periods of life. Don't worry about if your kids' pants are a little too short or they're not as clean as you wish they were. Let some things go so that you can take care of yourself. And, sometimes that is a sort of a way to kind of fit in the self-care that we need. It is sort of like this cost-benefit analysis and figuring out where things can what we can let go of so that we can prioritize things that otherwise would be we wouldn't have room for.
Yeah, no, that's great advice, and I think as you were saying, nothing lasts forever, and there's going to be times that are really intense with your kids. Well, a lot of times going to be intense, but different types of intensity, right? So when before your kid is sleep trained, right? When they're up in the night, you're going to feel exhausted and you're going to feel tired the next day, and but that's a pretty distinct period of time. That's going to end. And, as your kids get older, again, it just like us adults, like challenges don't go away, but they do change. And the other side of that, I think, is our kids, or it's helpful for me to think like my kids want to hang out with me right now. And once they become teenagers, I don't know, once they become, like that, it'll change. So if you also have that in mind, that, appreciate it while you have it. But I also really like, and I sometimes, and I know a lot of other parents do this, go too far towards that. I'm just going to be with my kids, whereas you really need the self care, and it's easy to let go of that, and then you find yourself, I'm super tired, I'm exhausted, I can't play with my kids, I can't be the great parent that I want to be, and well, that's why, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
because you need time for both. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of this other piece of wisdom that I love, which is, when you're with your kids, try to be with your kids. But if you find yourself distracted, extricate yourself and be not with your kids. But don't do half and half. The half and half is not recharging for you, right? And it's not satisfying for your kids. Nobody gets what they need. So be with your kids and then be not with your kids. It is good for them, even when they're little, to have you not available to them for pockets of time. I mean, you got to make sure that everyone is safe, of course, but it is not only okay for you not to be with your kids, it's good for them and good for you, and actually helps you to be more mindful and fully present when you are with them. I think that's a piece we just, in our society, we've come to this place of such fractured attention, which your children will pick up on and will let you know in various ways is not fulfilling and satisfying for them. And at the same time, if you're kind of with them but not fully with them, you're not getting the break that you may ultimately need to.
Yeah, that's great wisdom to, do one or the other. And if you find yourself doing both, then choose, do one, then the other. And like you're
Yeah.
saying, it's quality over quantity, right? You need to be
Right.
there with them fully if you're going to be there.
Yeah.
Um, and, for those of us who are, lucky enough to have spouses or partners and, we're parenting together, what do you recommend in terms of balancing both personal time, but even a bigger picture, saying, all right, there's a lot that we both need to do to create this family. How do you balance it? How do you know organize it? What advice have you heard that works, or do you give yourself to
Mhm.
others? Like, what
Yeah.
would you say?
Well, my bread and butter is, I mean, so it's kind of funny because I wrote a book about working parenthood, but my bread and butter is marital relationships. And I think the reason that I got so invested in this book about working parenthood is that I see everything through a relational lens, including the relationship between our life roles. But because of my specialization, I have a chapter dedicated to building connection even during the tougher patches of early parenting life and working parent life. It is really important, and I'm kind of saying like all these things are important, prioritize them all, but it's true. I think once you have kids, it's so tempting for many couples to say, well, when the baby doesn't need to be, isn't wearing a diaper, or when the toddler isn't under threat of holding a sharp knife the wrong way, or when the teenager can drive himself around, then we'll prioritize our relationship. And what I often see happening in my private practice is people come in after many years of kicking the can down the road on their relationship, and they've just grown so far apart and have built such relationship habits of distance and disengagement that it's really hard to kind of find their way back to each other. And so, my advice for couples, and this was the advice that I took myself, is to try not to kick the can down the road, but to engage in small, feasible habits that were practical for whatever the phase of time was. So, when you have super young kids and you really can't get out of the house, have a tradition of every Friday night having a cup of tea before you pass out on the couch together. Later, when your kids are a little bit older, have a practice of going out on a date once a month. If you can't afford a babysitter, do a date night exchange with friends that live nearby, where one week one half of the couple comes over and watches the kids, and the next week, if this makes sense, so like you have two couples and one of them goes out and the other couple divides and conquers. One half stays with their kids, the other half babysits the other kids, and then you switch. So it's a way to get a date night without paying for a babysitter. And there's other clever things that you can do like that. You can have a date night in the house. Make time once a week to talk about how you're doing. So this is sort of like what's called the marital checkup. So don't wait until you've grown so divided or until you're deep into a fight before checking in, but make it a habit to check in. How are we doing? um, have fun together, like build new hobbies, enjoy your kids together, celebrate the good things, be one another's supports. So it's really about keeping positive relationship habits going that are practical to do for whatever the phase of life is that you're in. And it may be less during the sleep deprived years, but don't give up on it. Just sort of keep the ball rolling, even if it's more slowly.
No, that's great advice because a lot of parents I've seen and experienced just, like you're saying, okay, we'll revisit this relationship once our
Right.
kids are X or Y or Z. And
Yeah.
it's not as simple as turning something off and on. That's not how relationships work, right? So, um,
Right. That's right. I mean, I think of relationships as like it's a living thing, like a plant, right? You can't just not water it and expect it to survive. You have to give it something, and you can think of it as like the winter. Maybe it needs less, but don't give it nothing because then it will wither. Give it something, give it what you have to give, and try to come back and check in. Do I have more to give now? Is this unable to shine today?
yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And then one more topic I wanted to kind of address, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on are connections outside of your family. So friendships, and those are another area that's very easy to get lost. And I, you know, I say this stereotype a lot, but I think it is somewhat true. It feels like moms tend to be better at creating community, creating these connections, whereas dads, we're not quite as good always at sharing our feelings, at um, again, creating friendships or keeping friendships up. What do you see that works, or what would you advise to parents who are again in the thick of it all, and we're saying, okay, I need to subtract, I need to subtract, I need to balance it all, but first, I guess, is that important, these outside relationships, and then what would you advise?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely important. There's no question. I mean, the science suggests that our strong ties are important, within our family, and our weaker ties outside of the family are super important too. And I will say, one of the earliest interviews that I did for this book was with a dad who had responded to a New York Times piece that I had written about motherhood. And he said he really objected to me focusing on motherhood and sort of the challenges of motherhood because he said, what doesn't get talked about is how hard it is to be a father. And one of the particular things that he felt was this under-discussed challenge was the community support piece. He had been a single dad, and he said, he wasn't really welcomed in the young parent groups because it was mostly mothers, and so he didn't have a place to turn to when there was a child challenge, and he felt, distinctly like unwelcome. Not even just that it wasn't like as comfortable as he wanted it to be. Like he wasn't wanted there, and that was a very painful thing for him, a very isolating thing for him, and really caused him some personal angst and challenging in the parenting domain because he didn't have that support. So I do think it's critically important for people to try to find a community. And I will say too that it can be helpful to sort of think about many of these things of like, see if you can kind of double dip, like, you know find your friendships at work, for example, or on the playground with like-minded people. Or if you're going to do activities with your partner, can you do it with another couple too? Like, I'm just sort of aware of a lot of the things that we're talking about doing feel like, okay, yet one more thing. But if you can sort of combine, it can make the lift a little less heavy. Um, but to remember that the social support piece is really important. And as we talked about earlier, this allo parenting idea of like we shouldn't parent alone, really gets to it is important to kind of be connected in community with other people. And to remember that the more you are engaged in community, the more like emotional social support you have, but also like the more tangible support you have access to in terms of like giving, like for example, I was talking to you about this strike that we had in my district a couple weeks ago, and being a part of a parenting community meant that if one of us had work that day, the other person could take the kids for the afternoon and allow the other person to work, so you could kind of take turns and support each other in that way. So there's all these forms of tangible support, but I do think it is harder for dads to connect into that. And I'm actually curious from your perspective, what have been some of the strategies that have been most helpful for you to find that?
Yeah, no, that's the advice I give and the advice that I take myself is to just try. Like you don't need a bat, excuse me, you don't need about 1,000. You can strike out as many times as you want. But what I find and what I hear from other dads who take the advice is just try. Ask someone to go out, ask someone to go to the playground, ask someone whatever it is, and open up to them. Be This word's a little scary for us dads, but be vulnerable. Say, gosh, I just
Yeah.
did something I'm not proud of, or I'm scared about this, I'm worried about this, or what do you feel about, that? And again, not every dad is like, yeah, let's go out or let's talk about this. Some dads are the more stereotypical, like male, da 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 da. But what I found is, especially when parenting comes in, it opens parents up, it opens dads up in new ways that they don't have a lot of experience in. And but I think all people want human connection, right? I mean, that's like a pretty basic thing,
Totally.
and it's easy to lose when you're parenting. So as dads, when we go out and ask, again, I've had a great hit rate myself, and I've heard the same thing where it's, yeah, I was surprised. Like all I had to do was ask, and now I have this community. I have these dads I can go out with, and but just starting there and being the one to take that initiative, I think, is key.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so hard. I mean, that the fear of rejection is so strong, and right, rejection is like one of the really painful things that we experience as humans. But the the fear of it happening suggests that it's more likely than it actually is. And the science on this is actually interesting too. Like this sort of just ask idea is like when you want something, we like agonize over it. But if you just ask, your likelihood of getting what you ask for is actually quite high when it comes to social connection. And it sort of flies in the face of what you feel. So I love that advice. And I think it's great that you're giving it in this on this platform.
Yeah, no, well, I appreciate that, and it's, also you can always, I would find it helpful to like kind of think about what you want your kids to turn into, like how you want them to act, and you
Yeah.
want them to know that you can feel uncomfortable, and if you don't
Yes.
ask for what you want, you're not going to get it. Certainly, if you do ask, you might. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Your chance of success if you don't ask is 100%, but if you ask, it's pretty good.
that's right, that's right. And to live with that discomfort a little bit, life is
Yeah.
amazing and has its ups and downs, and it has moments of discomfort that we kind of have to sit in, for better or worse. It's just a fact. So I think the more you can get used to feeling that, gosh, this is a little uncomfortable, but I'm trying to do something, and sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Again, that's a great lesson you want to teach your kids. So best way to do that is to model it yourselves, right?
100%. Yeah, that discomfort is often like the ticket to ride this journey of life, right? Is that if we don't take a risk, then we're not living big full lives. But if you do take a risk, you could fall flat on your face. It could not turn out the way that you want, but you could be taking a step towards more connection, more meaning, more fulfillment, more excitement, more interest. The things that really matter are often a little uncomfortable. Usually the discomfort is a sign that it matters to us. So if we don't feel that discomfort, it's often a sign that we're not doing the things that really matter to us.
That's right. No, that's great. That's great. And you know what? I do have one more topic before we go here, just because I'm real curious. In terms of us feeling as parents, we'll often feel kind of overprogrammed, or there's a lot going on. And I love the advice of subtracting and kind of figuring out what's important. How do you advise that to your kids? If your kids are in sports and they're in some extracurricular other activities, and they're managing their schoolwork and housework, like how do you help them balance that?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and in the subtraction conversation, what I often recommend people do, including my kids, is clarify their values. So values in acceptance and commitment therapy are defined as the ways that we care to show up, sort of the me that you want to be, the things that you care most about, and how you want to show up in doing them. And it's really about the process, not the outcome. But having clarity on the ways that you want to show up and the things you want to invest in can help you figure out what you don't value, what you don't want to be doing, what you don't want to invest in. And one of the most useful values clarification questions that I like to do, including with my kids, is do a future perspective taking exercise. So it looks like travel forward, to high school if you're talking to your kid in elementary school, or if it's your kid in high school, travel forward to your first job, and imagine your older self looking back on your current self. And when you do that, imagine what would your older self think, and what would they be proud that you did? What would they be proud that you invested your time and your energy into? Or what would they be glad that you didn't waste your time and your energy on? And that perspective taking exercise kind of helps you unhook from the current emotion or the shoulds or the social pressure that you might be feeling, and clarify for yourself what really matters to me. And by the way, it's a useful thing to do for yourself too when you're kind of hooked up in oh, I need to be doing this or I can't be doing that, to do that trip forward and say, if I look back on my life 30 years from now, am I really going to be glad that I worried about, attending this birthday party or spending a lot of money on this trip? Or would I be more glad that I had taken, the time to just, hang out with my kids, or, take more time thinking deeply about this work project? Whatever the thing is, there's not like a right or a wrong answer, but doing that future perspective, looking back on the current moment, can sometimes help you to clarify what's really important and what can I subtract because it's more non-essential to me.
I like that a lot. We talk about that. I think we call it like the rocking chair test or whatever. When you're sitting in your rocking chair old and you're looking back on your life,
Yeah. Oh, I like that. The rocking chair
you
test. I'll have to
what
use
did you
that.
like? What did what are you proud of? And but I haven't talked to dads, or I guess to my kids, about doing that same exercise, and just going fast forward a little bit, and saying, okay, well, in high school, what are you going to want to, be proud you did? That's really brilliant. I like that. I like that a
Yeah,
lot.
even young kids can kind of like I do this even with my 7-year-old. They get it, right? Like they can sort of do that. It'll be sort of at a different maturity level, but they can do this exercise. Many of them even at a younger age.
Yeah, no, that's great. This whole conversation, Yael, has been brilliant. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
I'm positive the dads are going to get a lot out of it. Again, you can find her book on Amazon or wherever books are sold. It's called Work, Parent, Thrive: 12 Science-Backed Strategies to Ditch Guilt, Manage Overwhelm, and Grow Connection. We touched on just a little bit of it, but if you read the book, it goes a lot deeper. And I also really appreciate how practical the book is. And you heard that from the conversation. It's like, well, subtract, and this is what subtraction is, and take care of yourself. And so it's really a great book. And then Yael, you can learn more about her and sign up for her newsletter at yaelschonbrun.com. I'll put that in the show notes, or you can search her name on Substack and find her there. So thank you so much, Yael.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun to chat.
Likewise. All right. Take care. Visit us at adadspath.com to learn more. Ready for the journey? Let's begin.